Hi, everyone. Okay, so I think I'm calling it that we will start now. Welcome to our webinar on getting the climate story right. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Nameerah Hameed, Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach. At Climate Outreach, we are rewriting the climate story. As we all know, climate change affects us all and involves all of us. But all too often, we see that the conversations about climate exclude and alienate people. We conduct original research at Climate Outreach to better understand what people from different places and backgrounds think and feel about the climate. We work with people and organizations to help create the best stories. We support the best storytellers to engage everyone. As part of this, we work with governments and policymakers in the UK as well as globally to show them the importance of engaging people in climate policy making as well as policy rollout. We cannot tackle climate change without a new climate story, from a lost cause to a story of people, progress, and potential. These days, I live in the beautiful borough of Barnet in North London. My community and my neighborhood may not be known for our climate action in the traditional sense, but I've seen that people here deeply care about nature and wildlife. So we see that concern about loss of nature has remained strong. And this is consistent with the research that we do at Climate Outreach and findings from our work of Britain Talks Climate. We see that we are 3 times more motivated to tackle climate change if we feel connected to nature and if it resonates with our core values. Right. So, how does all of this link to the general elections? This is a critical time to get the story right about climate and nature. Climate action needs strong leadership and a national climate story about people and possibility that all of us can feel a part of. And what is the evidence on the best things for climate communicators to say right now? How can activists, campaigners, politicians have good conversations about climate and net zero on the doorstep? All of this webinar will aim to cover as we discuss 2 election guides from Climate Outreach. We'll be joined by an excellent panel of climate communication experts to take your questions about how to cut through the noise with the brilliant story at election time. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Annabel Rice from Green Alliance, Dave Powell, my colleague from Climate Outreach, and Ben Jackson from Climate Center. If I can sort of start the discussion for today, Annabel, if I may turn to you first, I would love you to start our discussion today with your thoughts on the political importance of a positive climate, nature, net zero story in the public debate at election time. We would love to hear why you think the next parliament matters and why do we need ambition and unity on climate. Annabel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nameerah, and thanks so much for having me. I think this is a super important conversation. I think firstly, just to understand why this issue is so important in the election, it's really important that we take a step back and really look at the context, which you've already set out a little bit of. So not only are we in a critical decade of action on the nature and climate crises, but we're also in a really pivotal moment for politics of climate in this country. So we've made a huge amount of progress in recent decades on not just the narrative of climate, but also in policy on the ground. But recently we've seen a real shift in the way that political leaders are talking about climate change. You know, we used to have quite an enviable consensus on climate change within our parliament, which is somewhat fracturing in recent years. We've seen some trying to play into scare tactics of environmental action, trying to present it as a risk and a threat rather than the opportunity that it is. And people are becoming increasingly animated that their public freedoms are really under attack through net zero. So, because of the wider social and political context, things like high energy bills, crumbling public services, but also just the broader cost of living crisis affecting families across the UK, I think that parties have been really tempted to make environmental action a real wedge issue. And even if that isn't always reflected in policy, the narrative really, really matters. So instead of kind of running scared and hoping that some of these arguments don't cut through. What we're really desperately calling out for is political leadership and ambition on the nature and climate crises. We really can't ask individuals or members of the public to take strong action without a clear steer from government that this is an important agenda and that not only is it important, but they're actually going to help people with the transition so that no one and no community is left behind. Having said that, in the current context and with the election looming, we're obviously playing in an incredibly crowded field. So there's a lot of emphasis at the moment, and quite rightly, on the cost of living and the economy, and they're inevitably going to be the central framing of this election. But we also desperately need climate to be a part of that conversation if we're really going to create space for ambition post-election on both climate and nature. And we've got a really good story to tell. It's necessary, and also there's a huge level of public support. Climate change consistently makes the top 5 issues in polling with the public. And when we break that down, some of the policies are really, really popular, including renewables, which we often see as sort of maybe a culture war issue. Actually, there's real deep interest throughout the public. And we need to avoid those culture war divisions that are increasingly trying to be stoked. So do all that, we need to ensure current and also prospective parliamentarians and politicians, as well as members of the general public, feel incredibly confident to talk about the opportunities of the transition and really able to articulate why it matters, why we need ambition, why we need unity. And we need to tell, as I said, a positive story about climate action. And, for me, and that doesn't mean net zero in 2050, that means specific policies that people can really resonate with and respond to. I think often the big picture and blue sky stories can serve to create a narrative around net zero, that it's something that's far away, that it's out of line with most people's day-to-day activities. And I think that's why it's been so much easier to get cut through with things like sewage or recycling. It's something that people do experience in their day-to-day lives. So in terms of why this parliament matters, regardless of what happens on polling day, what we need is cross-party consensus on climate action, because, whilst these issues may be inherently political, they really shouldn't be party political. And not only is that kind of consensus needed to create certainty for businesses if they're to invest in the UK, but also for people. I think everyone deserves to live in a comfortable, warm home, to protect themselves against extreme weather, to have access to nature. We saw in the pandemic how valuable people found green space for both their mental and physical health. And a lot of these can really be presented as common sense. And I think you'd be really hard pressed to find any MP from any party who didn't want those things for their constituents. No one's going to say they don't want their constituents to be warm. So regardless of how we get there, what we need to do is make this an issue that cuts across party divides, that we can sell to the general public, no matter who they vote for, as just a massive opportunity for us to lead the world, but also to change day-to-day lives for the better and for the positive, and really bring people along on that journey. The last thing I'll just say is that, whilst this election is incredibly important, I think the next election may well be even more important. Even if Labour secures a large majority now, as it looks like they might, there's nothing to say this will be the case at the next election. And I think we all have a huge job to play in maintaining that centre ground and creating a really inclusive agenda that creates maximum involvement for people across the UK. So yeah, thank you.
Annabel, thank you so much. That sets the discussion and conversation for today's webinar excellently. Dave, I'm going to turn to you. As I sort of said in the intros, we have 2 guides from climate outreach during this time. One is getting the climate story right, and the other is talking climate on the doorstep, the links for which my colleague Siri has shared in the chat. So Dave will present more from our guides. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Nameerah. Annabel, thank you so much for your introduction as well. And thanks, Ben, for being here. The question and answer function is open if you want to put some questions in, which we can come to afterwards, be thinking about your questions. I'm going to talk a bit about mostly about this guide that we put out a couple of weeks ago. Snap guide looking at how to do exactly what Annabel was just challenging us all to do. So how to get that climate story right at election time. A lot of the stuff in here will apply not just at election time, is useful advice. We're also going to bring in something from another guide that we put together. And this is what we're going to cover in my 10 or 15 minutes with you. So some things to remember, first of all, about what our research at Climate Outreach and other organizations in the same sort of space are finding about what the climate story really is right now. It's a complicated story, but there are some common themes in there to remember in your communications, to reflect in your communications. And then we've got some do's and don'ts for how to talk about climate change in an election, and just generally, these are good bits of advice that we pointed at an election context, so hopefully useful. And I'm going to finish just with a few minutes of some tips for if you're on this call and you're out there having doorstep conversations, you're talking to people one-to-one at election time, or maybe not at election time. We've got a big bank of stuff from our archives about how to have great, productive climate conversations one-to-one. And we pulled some of that together that might be useful for political conversations right now. So first of all, 4 things to remember right now. The first is to remember that climate leadership is a vote winner. Not everybody will think that, but broadly, people expect the next government to crack on and invest. I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. Remember that climate leadership excites people and is broadly a positive thing. And secondly, related to that, remember that caring about climate and nature, as Nameerah was saying in her opening remarks, there's this everyday normalized climate concern. It's often in the background. It's not always expressed very loudly in politics, but people do care about climate and nature. And we have these things in our pocket. We need to bank them as big picture macro bits of the story. And then the second 2 things to remember are more about the practicalities and the tangible stuff, where conversation gets a little bit more nuanced. So the third thing to remember is, while there are some amazing big figures that can be thrown around, some big economic arguments about the transition, the promise of the green economy, all of these things, that actually the stuff that really moves people and excites people and changes politics is the stuff that we can see and feel in our lives. Now, the great news is that a lot of that is happening, but our job in communications is often to make stuff that is already going on in our lives feel real to people, rather than in the abstract land of promises of stuff that may or may not happen one day. And then the fourth point, there's no getting around the fact that times are tough, and some people are worried about transition, worried about the costs, worried about the cost possibly that they might think will be coming for them, or that they think in general. It is the government's job to do a much better job on communication and engagement and involvement and exciting people about that. But also us as communicators do need to empathize with that. Not all of these concerns by any means are the basis of disinformation or misinformation. There are some real costs. People are having a tough time out there, and the climate story has to be one that's empathetic and fits in with that. So these are the top 4 things to remember, and I'll say a little bit more about them now. So the first thing, and this comes from our major new research, Britain Talks Climate. I can't see the chat, but hopefully Siri can put a link in there if you haven't already, Siri. Sorry if you already have. The thing we heard is that right across society, people want politicians to get on with doing something about climate change and nature. They see it as government's job. They're pretty down on politics right now, but they think in general still this is the kind of thing politicians should lead on, and they think there's still time for them to do it. And the good news is that at the headline level, we asked people, would you vote for a party, any party, that said it would either keep the current pace or speed up the pace of climate action? 60% of people said that they would. Only 15% of people say they would actively vote for a party that would slow down net zero. This slide and a few of the ones after it, I think, are really important for context, because I think particularly if we spend a lot of time on Twitter or a lot of time in other echo chambers, we can feel that there is more inherent resistance to climate and net zero than there actually is. It's certainly not to say it's not there, particularly amongst some people who vote a particular way, but in general, the mood in this country is get on with it, keep on with it. And the mood is also that it's good news for the UK. So nearly 2/3 of people said they think this thing, net zero, whatever that means to them, this concept, will be good news for the UK's economy. And only 10%, so basically hardly anyone in statistical terms, thinks it's bad news. These are all good figures. And behind all that is that acting on climate is seen as something that is a good thing, makes us feel happy, makes us feel positive. We have positive associations about climate. We're seeing in our research people are more and more worried about the impacts of climate and noticing it, and conversation is more normalized. And the idea that a party would do something about it makes us feel positive. We asked people for an open word. How would you feel if a party pledged significant climate investment? Again, any party, we didn't specify. And we did some analysis on the words that came out, and 50% of the words that came out were positive, 27% neutral, only 23% of them were negative. And the word that was used more than any in that positive cluster was happy. So this is all, we're in a good place. We're in a good place with the idea of climate action at the headline level. And we're also in a good place with the fact that this is more normal now. It is not, you are not a freaky weirdo if you care about climate change. You might have been a freaky weirdo if you cared about it 20 years ago. You're not a freaky weirdo now. You are normal. We did focus groups with people right across the country from all demographics. And this was a quote from someone in one of our focus groups in one of the more maybe politically distrustful, disengaged segments. Even people in these focus groups have this just general sort of day-to-day sense that, yeah, this is a thing we need to do something about. I do my bit. There's got to be a point in acting on this. And in various forms, while people, this is a distrustful time and people have had a bad truck with politics over the last 10 years and, things aren't great for people, still it is seen that now climate and nature are something we care about and we act on. And we should just remember this in our communications. We are not trying to make a case to most people that this matters. People get it. And we did our research at the start of January this year. So whether this number is precisely right, you see things something like this, that climate and nature, given the cost of living crisis, given what's going on in the health service, given everything else dominating politics, climate and nature remains a high priority for people. For some people, it's their most important issue going into the election. All of that is the context. And I say that to remember that we're on fertile ground with a good climate communication story. And let's talk a bit more about some of the tangible stuff. So the third thing to remember is it's so important. I mean, Annabel hit the nail on the head with this. Get tangible and get practical. In climate communication terms, you cannot make this stuff feel more chewy and real. You really can't. Go for it, bring it home. People are really skeptical of big claims that things will be better in future. Ben might want to talk to this, but every politician for the last 10 years has promised a big plan. There was levelling up, there were post-Brexit plans, there were big ideas, and people are very skeptical about it because none of it seems to have happened. And that plays into a general kind of context of people just not trusting that things are going to be better in the future because we've been promised that for years and it's not there. But look, climate action is happening. There are businesses that are creating jobs. There are community energy schemes that are lowering bills. There are the changes to town centres where people live all over the place, where it's easier to travel around by public transport or by bike. It's how we're building houses, more and more solar panels on houses. It's how we're thinking about health, more and more action on climate change. Nature is increasingly part of people's lives. This is not to say everything is wonderful and you can just say, look, it's all great, look out your window, because of course there's a long way to go. But where there is great stuff happening locally, happening that you can tangibly point to, that really does resonate with people so they can see it and believe it and see it and feel that it's happening now. And the fourth point, I'm going to spend a little bit longer on this and I'll come to it also in the conversation stuff, is empathy is so important right now that there is this sense, we're picking it up in our focus groups, it's there in the politics, it's stronger now than it was when we started doing Britain Talks climate research 4 years ago. Worries about fairness of the transition are real, particularly amongst people on lower incomes, and particularly where people look at for example, how much they feel they need to use their car and they don't see any better public transport around. Not only do they not think there's a big plan to fix that, but they're worried about what that means for them personally. Just an example of a quote that we got from a relatively kind of centrist focus group member earlier this year. When we start having conversations about transition and the economic transition and what it means for people, some people will very quickly go to a kind of, oh, I'll have to do more stuff that I can't afford, situate it in a context of a cost of living crisis. And this is the terrain that we're in, and these are tough times for people. And your communications has to be empathetic to that, and your communications has to respond with what should be done about that, rather than saying it's not a thing or putting it all down to disinformation or misinformation, which is not to say that's not a thing, but it's not the only thing driving people's worries. These are tough times. Something we found from our research for really consistently, and I think this runs across most work on anything to do with fairness that we've found, is that uniting young and old, northern and southern, rural and urban, uniting the whole country in our research across all segments, is this really commonly held idea that the people who have the least money shouldn't have to do the same as the people who have the most. The burden of the transition should not fall equally on everyone, particularly that everyone should have to pay the costs of low carbon technology. This is the only thing of a load of policy questions that we tested. It was the only one that came out that a majority of people said that policy goes too far. And I think this is the idea that everyone should have to pay for technology themselves. And what we think that means is that people want to feel that the government is taking the lead on this, that this is a whole society effort, and the government is taking this seriously. And we think our communications should reflect that. So a few tips for some do's and don'ts of what this all might mean in communications in an election period, and hopefully more useful for the longer term as well. So we recommend, from our research, from our advice over the years, your climate communication should, number one, show that climate action is normal. So do take the opportunity to say at the big level or the little level, by which I mean nationally or locally where you live, people care about climate and they want to see action on it. What we don't recommend is that you spend any longer than you really need to, if you need to at all, giving airtime to the fringe groups, and they are fringe groups, who say that climate action is bad for the economy or are trying to slow it down or trying to make it a culture war. These are fringe groups. Those of us who want to see action are the normal ones, are the majority. Don't give too much time. Don't get drawn into the terrain of people who want to make this seem like there's more opposition than there is. You're only feeding it. So climate action is normal and you should reflect that. Secondly, try to avoid climate change being pitted against other things, particularly the cost of living crisis. So climate action is a thread that runs through everything that's happening in our economy at the moment. Both the problems that we have, it's a major, energy and climate are a major part of what's going on with economics and the cost of living right now, but also the solutions. And it can be tempting to go, oh, the climate should be the number one thing that we're talking about in this election, more important than cost of living. People have got their priorities wrong. Well, that not only is not empathetic, but it's not true, because these things are joined up. So do talk about how climate action can help with the cost of living, how clean energy is better than oil and gas. Don't pit these things together and describe it as joined up across the whole economy. Climate action is common sense. It's the smart thing to do. It's not a radical idea. Most people don't like radical ideas, and in any event, it isn't one. People want to generally feel that ideas are sensible and common sense and not fringe. So just talk about the ways in which doing all the stuff that we need to do on energy and wave and solar and air pollution and health and all these things is just a smart thing that a smart government does. Own that narrative and claim it, because it is common sense, and what it shouldn't seem is something that is radical and threatening. Fourthly, I think this is really important. I've worked in NGOs that do a slightly weird thing where they have like a climate team and a nature team, and climate messaging and nature messaging, and they tell a climate story and then they tell a nature story. And then once a year they go, well, we should probably get together and join that up somehow. Most people, this comes out, Nameerah mentioned this at the start, this comes out so strongly in our research. They think this is all the same thing. We have a general sense that climate action is good for nature and doing something about nature is linked to climate change. People don't see these as separate. They don't see them as a thing where we're either acting on climate or nature. And it's probably a bad move to kind of go, well, why we're talking about climate, but why aren't we talking about nature? In communications terms, these are the same things. Say climate and nature, talk about the climate and nature crisis. As Nameerah said, it's a way in for so many people to care about the green stuff in their life, the parks, the gardens, the seas that they love. And then the fifth and final recommendation on comms is, and this is to the essence of Nameerah's starting challenge about making this seem like a story of possibility. There's so much fatalism around right now. Some research in the last couple of days has come out on this, from John Curtis and others. We are pretty distrustful as a country right now. There is a skepticism about government. But we find that people still think government's the thing, if not necessarily this government or even necessarily the next government, but they still think that governments can still do something. There is still this kernel of belief that politics and systems can solve the climate crisis, and indeed should. And don't stoke it. Try not to kind of make it seem like we're buggered whatever we do, because we're not. And the story that voters want climate leadership, want whoever wins the election to get on with it, feels more in keeping with the story of possibility that's so essential for something that can seem as big a deal as climate is. So look, I'm nearly finished. Just a couple of minutes about some tips for how to have productive climate conversations on the doorstep. And we really loved, actually, well, we didn't particularly love having an election sprung on us with no notice, but we did really love the opportunity to stitch together a few tips from bits of work we've done over the years, and indeed presented at a workshop that Annabel and colleagues were running a couple of weeks ago on this. So here's how we can have, if you're out there having climate conversations in a political sense or a non-political sense, some tips that might be useful. Firstly, remember that most people support this stuff. So people can be worried about conversations about climate change. They think they might get shouted at. They expect every other person to say it's all made up. They won't. You might get some opposition, but nowhere near as much as you think. Most people support climate action. And even if they don't support that concept, they care about nature. They'll care about the impacts. They'll care about their parks and their local places and what they think green stuff is. And most conversations will go well. So the first thing is to have that in your head, to remember that don't be afraid of the conversation. So one bit of work that we've pulled together here, and Siri's put a link, I assume I can't see it, to the guide that we put together on this. We did some research and released it a couple of months ago now about trust building. So at the heart of any great conversation about climate change or anything is trust. And indeed at the heart of great political communications is trust. And we did research with across 7 segments of society that underpin our wider work. And we found these 3 things that came out consistently that people ranked as being important to who they trust, what are essential components of a trusted conversation. Firstly, that people think you're empathetic and care about them. Secondly, that people think you're passionate and you care about your issue. And thirdly, that you're credible, you're not making stuff up, and your facts are back-upable, or at least, they're not completely pulled out of thin air. It's really important in any climate communication, but particularly in an interpersonal one where we're so primed to be ready for people trying to sell us stuff, particularly at election time, to come across genuinely as these things. So it's worth reflecting on whether you do, and what you might be able to do about it if you're in any way coming across to some people as not any of these things. So this is from a broader research report called Trust and Influence, which we released a couple of months ago, as I said, but also we summarize it in an infographic and a guide. And then these are just some tips for how to have an empathetic conversation. What does the empathy bit mean? It means listening and responding to the worries that you hear, and not always trying to win a conversation. It can be so tempting in any conversation to be thinking one step ahead, thinking about, how do I win? How do I counter what they've just said? A huge part of a climate conversation is just asking people questions about what climate means to them, what nature means to them, how their lives are going, and seeing how those things happen, and just listening to what comes out, listening authentically and trying to find common ground. You will agree about what climate means in all sorts of ways, about how climate and nature are important to our lives, the things that we love and the things that we love doing. Find that common ground. It's how you have great conversations in the pub, and it's how you have great conversations on the doorstep too. And then if you are political or in some way, trying to canvass politically, one of the most important things is not to promise you'll do something that you can't do. So great political conversations are honest about the fact that some of this is complicated, and don't promise you can do things if you can't do them. So honesty and authenticity are really core to a good conversation. This is all built on it's by far our most downloaded bit of work, the Talking Climate Handbook that's referenced there, which is an extensive guide to how to have climate conversations at work or on the doorstep or with people that you love. And we're really proud of it as a bit of work. And these are some of the principles that come through. And final slide, just good things to know anyway. And this is right back to Annabel's starting challenge about, making this real and bringing it home. So if you're having a climate conversation, and actually this works just as well if you're talking nationally as locally, what are the hot topics that people care about? What are the ways in which climate change, its impacts, its opportunities are relevant, are being talked about, the worries and the fears are happening? in the area that you're talking to people about? Are there great examples you can point to that make it real and tangible, that people would go, oh yeah, I can see actually that, I can see that happening? How can you bring it to life for people as a story of possibility? And if you're from a political party and you want to have a sustained conversation about how you take people seriously and not just at election time, what will your party do to continue to involve people in the conversation about net zero and climate and everything as part of a healthy conversation about where they live? Thank you. Thank you for listening to me talking. I'll hand back to Nameerah. There's a feedback form there. I think Siri might also put a link in the chat to it, but we'd love to know if don't go yet because we're about to have some questions, but by the end that would be a great thing to do. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. I'm sure everyone finds this useful in how to have better conversations. We have one comment in the chat. Imad says he likes the messaging coming out of this about being unapologetic for caring about climate change, backed by what the public cares about, and seeing it as something that cuts across issues and not as an either or against cost of living. So continuing with the discussion, Ben, if I can turn towards you, what stories do you think need to be heard about climate change over the coming weeks, and from whom?
Thanks, Nameerah, and thanks, Dave, also for organising this for climate outreach. I think you guys are probably one of the most credible outfits in considering these changes and how this communication works on the ground. And I also really enjoyed your thoughts, Annabel, on this. I think, yeah, in terms of the stories, I think for me, it feels like everything we've heard about this election is slightly wrong, in that we were told this isn't a climate election, but it feels like it actually is. And I say that because it's not the conversation, it's the outcome that will decide climate action here. And even though the conversations are focused on other things, the outcomes will be significantly different. So if Labour win this election, they will be committing themselves to doubling the investment in insulation, to doubling onshore wind. They will be tripling the amount of solar. They will be quadrupling the amount of offshore wind. They will be banning new diesel and petrol vehicles by 2030, and they will be banning new oil and gas. That is an incredible change, but it's not really up for discussion in that way. We don't hear climate mentioned. So I think if you look at the parties, you probably got Reform, who I would suggest are definitely hitting the brake, if not going in the other direction. Certainly the Conservatives, who want to maintain the status quo, and Labour, who are pushing ahead on climate. So whether or not we think it's been directly about climate, the outcome could be probably the most significant climate verdict that we've had as a population, which is really interesting, I think, in terms of action and on the ground. I do think that in terms of how government works, it is hard to push these things through. And cost of living, I think, was the question, that how do we make these things that Imad asks, how can you care about the climate and also agree it doesn't, stop it becoming a cost of living issue. And one of the things I did last week was actually go up to a place called Jaywick, which is in Clacton, which is obviously Reform, the seat that they want to win, and yet it's the poorest place in Britain, based on almost all metrics. And one of the big problems they have there is that they have a population of people who moved into holiday homes. It was holiday homes which were rented out in the 1930s and have now been taken over, and the town pretty much live in these holiday homes. And the transformation for that community is based on, can you insulate them? Because they spend all the money on heating. They don't have gas, so they do need heat pumps. They need solar because that'll help their bills. And that transformation is actually beginning in that community, but it will lift them out of extreme poverty, which is caused by gas, the cost of gas. And the other amazing thing about this community is they're currently building an £8 million seawall around it. because the rising sea levels on the East Coast are threatening them. And this is the community that lost nearly 50 people in floods in the last century. So I think that the thing we're saying about cost of living is that these people probably need that transition more than anyone. And for us to ignore it would be, would be unsupportable, really, because this is one of the biggest changes we can make in their, in their ability to thrive, and also it brings a lot of economic activity to the area, and I think we will see that. We've already seen that a little bit with Ben Houchen in the Teesside area, where he's talked about that, and he's been returned for the third time as a mayor. And obviously, we might have views about how investment is going into that community, but he has talked up and made sure that that economy is being led in a way that addresses climate. And I think that is transformational for people who need new industries. We've got Port Talbot, where they're losing the steel, and we have to confront these conversations about how do we lift these predominantly coastal communities and bring them with us, and actually so that they benefit from the change. So I think you're very right in asking that question, and I think there is a tendency to talk about climate as if it's a cost. And yes, there is a cost, but there is also opportunity for these communities to benefit. And that's what I think we have to be able to land in the course of that next 5 to 10 year period to 2030.
Excellent, Ben. Thank you so much. I find the examples that you've shared the most useful because it really sort of brings the point home. Annabel, if I can move towards you again, I wonder if you can share more on positive climate stories that work, and especially, if you can sort of weave into this simple language that resonates more with people. We know that net zero carries a lot of baggage, unfortunately. Words such as emissions, might not resonate as much as air pollution, which is simpler. So what are some of the ways to meaningfully talk to people about climate?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And on net zero, I know there's been some back and forth about whether or not it's a useful term for the sector more broadly to be using. I think for me, it's just something that means too many things for too many people. And as you say, that can come with baggage, and that it's very easy to attack and tell negative stories around the cost or the risks. Whereas, as we were saying before, like going into some of those tangible things that will improve people's lives. So, for example, we do a lot of work on warm homes in collaboration with field poverty, environment, and health groups. And that's been a really incredible experience, in the learning to navigate those spaces together and telling a positive story has I think really, really, really worked. And it's not that we should use cost of living messaging to further the climate agenda. It's not trying to co-opt something. What it's saying is that the two are fundamentally linked, and the more that we're able to tell that story and really show that, as Ben was saying, bills are high because of gas price rises, and really conveying that. I think there's a few other examples I've already mentioned, like talking about recycling or talking about sewage. I think air quality is another one that, whilst some of the motorist parts themselves come with baggage, air quality in general, I think is something that really cuts through with the public and really resonates. I think really we all know how to have these conversations in a way that's simple. I think if you think about how you have these conversations with your family or your friends or your partner, are you ever really coming in with your scientific data? It's just not what works. I think David said it too, that, finding that common ground, we all have a shared interest in having, whether it's green space or having a safe and comfortable environment is something we can all really relate to. And there's things across that spectrum which will resonate with at least somebody. And you have to be willing to be adaptable and flexible. And I think that often the people who are speaking out negatively against net zero or against climate action more broadly, they've actually done really well in terms of being able to be flexible and adaptable, because you can say, oh, but this, this scientific thing is true, and they can say, oh, but what about this? And they're so flexible with their narratives, and we need to be like that too. We need to be able to change and adapt our messaging, our language, even the way in which we present ourselves. I think, a lot of us might be, say, Westminster centric, but the way that this transition will look is going to be so different across the country. And Ben was talking about Clacton. I think it's such a good example of somewhere where people are really genuinely struggling, and their concerns and their fears are incredibly valid and should be acknowledged. And it's sort of I think part of the reason why people like Reform have become popular is because they're conveying a really simple message and just saying, like, this is the solution to all of your problems. And that's obviously not reality, but I think we need to be really good that when we're talking about climate, we're, as well as saying what the impacts are going to be and talking about climate change more broadly, what are the solutions? What can people do? Solutions need to be like fundamentally woven through any of the language that I think that we use.
Thank you. Dave, we have a comment from Hameed. He says that he likes that you mentioned empathy. Research shows that it's intrinsic to human nature to care about others, and care is something that the neoliberal right in America has worked to undermine as a legitimate thing to campaign on. I wonder if you have any comments on this.
Ooh, yeah, I do. And I also wanted to come back, it sort of links to a couple of comments on what Annabel and Ben have said as well. So I think Ben is right. Sorry, Hameed, I'm going to ask you a question in a kind of, well, your thought in a roundabout kind of way. I think Ben is right that there's an awful lot to play for in this election in terms of what happens on climate change. I think there's also an awful lot to play for in terms of the longer term narrative on whatever comes on the right after this election and what that looks like on climate change. We haven't had an effective anti-climate populist in this country before, and we may or may not have an effective one still operational in politics in a few weeks' time. Central to whether Labour are going to be able to do a big chunk of the stuff Ben quite rightly says they promised to do, everything from planning reform to insulating homes. Central to that is people thinking it's in their interest and it's a good thing. That is about story, but it's also about group identity and kind of about, is this something that people like me do? And what worries me about what started to happen at the margins of the climate conversation from Nigel Farage and from Rishi Sunak a while ago is starting to make this a thing, like they want net zero is a thing that they are doing to you, and this bringing in of a populist frame into our climate politics that hasn't been there before. And it does worry me, and this is why so many of the recommendations that we had, they are about empathy first and foremost, like not about sort of one group appearing to belittle or not care about another and not playing into that trap. And so I do think empathy is important, and understanding that there are people who don't trust environmental campaigners, don't trust particular politicians, and being very alert to that, and wherever humanly possible, not triggering anything if you're having a climate conversation or doing climate communications, being really alert to it. Okay, it is being weaponized, but also not seeming as if you don't care about people's lived reality and what that means. It really does matter. I'm not saying that defeats the incredibly, well-funded, very clever moves that are happening on the fringes to try to weaponize net zero as a term. And I think, to Annabel's point, I do think as a term, it's something like human rights. It's a term that people are trying to weaponize to make it, to symbolize they don't care about you. This is a thing being done to you. I worry about what that looks like long term, but I think our job as communicators is not to stoke it, is to own the narrative that actually this isn't an elite plot that is elites doing things to people. It's about great jobs and great homes and the stuff that people want and the things that improves their lives. Empathy is core to that, I think. But that group identity thing is so important to be on the right side of now, I think.
Thank you, Dave. Ben, I have my last question for you now, and sort of last remarks that you might have. I think you've mentioned this, and Anne and David also mentioned this, but we really would appreciate specifically asking you, sort of if you shared your thoughts about how harmful you think it is that Reform are pushing an anti-net zero line right now. We've talked about this a little sort of headline, but I think just to go a little deeper into that would be super useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Nameerah. I agree. I think clearly it was the event of this election campaign so far, perhaps the Nigel Farage's decision to run, and I think it will have significant play with the electorate. I think that's quite clear now, and actually, when you see papers like the Daily Mail this morning talking about Reform's economic fantasy, you see that the relatively right-wing media has recognised as quite a significant threat if Reform do get the votes that they look like and take them away from the Tory party, and that they see that hemorrhaging of support is going to be dangerous, probably not only for them but for the country. So I think there is definitely a real threat there. I mean, you asked initially sort of what are the stories I'd like to see come out of this election. I think one of them would be what I'd like to call the mirage of Farage, is that here is this charismatic politician, but really there's not that much behind it. He's talked about he's complained about the vetting procedures of his own candidates today. You look behind that curtain and it really is Wizard of Oz stuff, because there is nobody else really there, but he does play on sentiment of, in his party, but he plays on public sentiment extremely well. He's a virtuoso when it comes to playing those sort of feelings of people. But you also, like, their manifesto came out yesterday. They talked about tidal energy. They talked about bringing more small modular nuclear in, and it's kind of that sort of confusion that actually, when you start to unwrap it, it goes, well, what are you actually doing? Did you throw that in because you thought people want a bit of climate? I suspect they do, because the Conservative Environment Network did some polling the other day and found 1/3 of Reform voters want action on climate, and actually 80% of them said they wanted to max out on renewables. So it's like, I think we have to understand that Reform also, to be a trusted party at some point, cannot be this extreme party. They actually have to move the alternative way and move towards the center ground if they're going to be credible. So I think there is something of that already happening. I think Richard Tice, when he was running the party, was kind of he talked about climate and volcanoes and all sorts of crazy stuff, and you kind of go, I'm not sure that's going to play with the public. So for them to actually become credible, they need to establish a party behind Nigel Farage. That's not going to be a quick thing. They have to establish a foothold in the center of the public conversation, and that's also difficult. So I think while it is dangerous, and I agree, it's dangerous in Europe and it's dangerous here, and it's also dangerous when we reflect on the sort of macro conversations. Cleaning the grid, I think most people agree with. Suddenly doing something in my house to, bring in a new heat pump or something, that's more tangible, more difficult. And people will easily, there are flashpoints there. But I think they have an enormous difficulty. We've seen this in Europe already, that there are one-person sort of protest parties. And I think that's basically what Reform is. And it would be a surprise to me if they can parlay that into something that's really credible with an electorate in the next couple of years. But, the Conservatives have a big job to do. The other untold story for me is, like, why did the Conservatives lose? And if that's the case, who tells that story, and why did they lose the center ground, and how did they move away from consensus on climate? And I think that's a fundamental flaw in everything they've done in this election campaign. So, but let's see. We haven't got there yet.
That's super useful. Thank you. We have one question in the Q&A. Any advice on talking about 0.7% of national income on overseas development assistance, not only as the right thing to do by the poorest people in the world, but also to stem the push factors that are causing low-skilled people coming to the UK? This is in terms of addressing their climate resilience to address climate displacement. Any of you, Annabel, David, Ben, who might want to take this?
Well, someone's just started mowing the lawn out there. So
it's okay. I don't think we can
I have
hear
a slight excuse that I can say, not an expert in how to frame aid, other than I suspect you don't start from talking about 0.7% of overseas development assistance. I expect you start from talking about the human stories, and you put what this means for the people in whose aid that is, and you talk about how that connects to our lives here and the things that we care about in this country, and what you want to build is a common story about it. I mean, there's some fairly straightforward comms approaches that I think run through that issue, Emma, but also some of the stuff we've been talking about here: make it human, bring it home, connect to people's emotions and stuff they care about. Sorry, not to have a better answer.
I just had, I mean, just one addition to that, because I think that's an excellent answer, Dave. But I think just to say, one of the stories I think that's been missing and that we don't hear, that I'd really like to hear, and I'm not sure how we can surface, is what are the push factors in migration, right? What are the things that, you know, not the pull factors that people say, well, it's a better, you know, economic lifestyle, it's, you know, et cetera. But what are the push factors that are happening in the places where people are migrating from, and why are they doing that? And listen, if it's 40 degrees and we're talking about really difficult situations with water, with you know, agriculture and those sort of things, how do we understand those better? And I think there's empathy needed there to really understand what those lives are like for people to leave their homes. And I would love to be able to see a better educated British public who really understands some of those drivers which make life so unbearable that, you know, they have to move.
My colleague just reminded me that a part of our team works on climate migration, and she's sharing a link to one of the reports in the chat. We think that would be useful. There is also one other question. Any advice on talking to big industry regarding climate policy? Not so much action themselves. The person who asked this question works in the built environment and construction, built big polluters, and trying to get them to see the importance of good climate story. If any of you would like to take this.
I can maybe just say a quick comment. I think that we've really got on our side is that climate action makes total economic sense, and especially for the UK, we actually have a really big opportunity to lead. And I think, you know, certain businesses have really been at the forefront of that and have seen that, and what they've actually been crying out for is kind of certainty from government, so that they can take advantage of some of the opportunities that already exist. So I would just say that when having those conversations, like, there are benefits to be had for British businesses within the net zero transition, and trying to articulate what some of those are for specific businesses, specific causes, I think is probably the most valuable thing. But yeah, no expert on the subject.
Just to quickly jump in, I mean, yeah, 100%, right? And I think one of the most frustrating things about climate delayer narratives is the idea that the world is going to be anything other than going full speed ahead on low carbon stuff. Like, this is the economy now. This is what I said in my talk. You know, it's not separate to conversations about the economy. It is the jobs we're going to have and what it means to be competitive in the 21st century. So it's not even, I mean, Annabel's entirely right, you know, it's an opportunity, but it's not even that, and this is happening, right? So this is an opportunity you either seize or you get left behind. And I think, you know, non-party political point, but I think that Labour have done a really good job at that story, that as part of their sort of story of reassurance to business. I think both Keir and Ed Miliband have talked very well about this being an opportunity that is great for Britain, which we see in our research that people think, rather than an obligation to be managed, which I think is often how it's kind of thought about.
Thank you so much again, Annabel, Ben, and Dave, for joining us for this webinar. If anyone has any pressing last remarks to give, you are more than happy to do so. But if not, we do have a feedback form that my colleague is sharing in the chat function. So I want to leave a couple of last few minutes to make sure that you have some time to fill that out. It helps us to deliver better webinars in the future. So yeah, any remarks? But if not, we're just going to stay on for one more minute while people open that feedback form that my colleague has very diligently done. But again, thank you so much. I found this useful. Even though we work in the sector, but I think just sort of hearing different examples from different perspectives is always very, very useful. So yes, thank you again. Hopefully this was useful for the rest of you as well. My colleague has shared all the useful links to our reports, guides, handbooks, forms in the chat function. And yes, thank you so much. And we will see you guys around soon.